report titled Children and Armed Conflict in Burkina Faso was published in April and accused both Islamist militant groups and government forces of abuses against children, including enlisting them as combatants, sexual abuses, and attacks on hospitals and schools.
Why would a country at war choose to expel the very United Nations envoy meant to help it? That is exactly what Burkina Faso has done, ordering out Carol Flores Marechniak after a UN report accused not only insurgent rebels, but also Burkina forces of abusing children. The junta dismissed the findings as unfounded and branded the diplomat persona non grata. So what is behind this sudden rupture? And why does a single report carry the power to ignite such fury? Let's find that out. Burkina Faso has once again demonstrated that it will not bow to the dictates of international institutions that claim neutrality while undermining African nations. In a bold move that has rippled across the diplomatic world, the junta led by Captain Ibrahim Traoré expelled the United Nations' most senior representative in the country, Carol Flores Marechniak, declaring her persona non grata. The decision came after the release of a UN report that accused not only insurgents but also Burkina soldiers and community defense forces of committing atrocities against children caught in the conflict. At first glance, some outsiders might see this as just another clash between a military government and an international watchdog. But for Burkina citizens, it is a fight for dignity, for sovereignty, and for the honor of soldiers who have given their lives in a war that the UN has never had to fight. The report at the center of the controversy claimed that more than 2,000 children had been recruited, abused, or killed over the past 2 years, attributing blame not only to insurgent affiliates but also to Burkina Faso's forces. Yet, as the junta quickly pointed out, the document contained no hard evidence, no judicial rulings, no verifiable court records, and no consultations with Burkina authorities before being published. It was, in essence, a verdict delivered without trial. For the government, this was unacceptable. By equating the Burkina army with insurgents, the UN crossed a red line. It blurred the distinction between those who butcher civilians and those who risk their lives to protect them. In a nation where soldiers and volunteers are celebrated as valiant fighters, defending their homeland from insurgent invasion, such allegations were not simply offensive, they were dangerous. They undermined morale at a time when the country needed unity and resolve, and they gave insurgent groups a propaganda victory they could never have achieved on their own. This is not the first time Burkina Faso has had to stand up against outside attempts to dictate its narrative. In 2022, just months after Traoré rose to power, the government expelled Barbara Manzi, Flores Marechniak's predecessor, for describing how the conflict had devastated education and health services. Once again, the UN's top envoy had chosen to highlight the country's failures rather than its resilience, projecting an image of despair rather than acknowledging the enormous sacrifices being made to defend the population. The message then was clear: Burkina Faso will not allow outsiders to weaken its spirit. With this latest expulsion, the message has become even louder. Burkina Faso will not allow outsiders to tarnish its soldiers. For years, the UN has claimed the mantle of neutrality, but its actions often tell a different story. Reports are published without meaningful consultation. Complex realities are reduced to statistics. The nuances of local defense efforts are ignored. And worst of all, these documents circulate globally, shaping the way donors, partners, and even Burkina citizens view their military. In this way, the UN does not merely observe, it actively shapes the battlefield of perception. For a government fighting one of the deadliest insurgencies on the planet, such interference is unacceptable. Captain Traoré has made it clear that Burkina Faso's sovereignty is not negotiable. He has rejected French military presence, embraced new partnerships with Russia, and emphasized that African states must reclaim control of their destinies. Expelling Flores Marechniak fits within this broader vision. It was not a rash act of anger, but a calculated declaration that Burkina Faso will not be judged by institutions that neither share its sacrifices nor respect its sovereignty. Critics abroad may frame this as authoritarianism, but for many Burkina it is an act of defense as vital as any battle against insurgents. A soldier on the front line does not fight for UN approval. He fights for his people. By protecting the reputation and morale of these fighters, Traoré is defending the very foundation of Burkina Faso's survival. Still, one question remains. Why does the UN always seem to focus more on scrutinizing African governments than on dismantling the insurgents in African villages? Why are the very institutions tasked with supporting nations in crisis instead so eager to publish reports that weaken them? For Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government, the answer is clear. It is about shaping the narrative. Burkina Faso's war is not only fought with bullets, it is fought with words, headlines, and reports that circulate in New York, Geneva, and Paris. Every time the UN accuses Burkinabe forces of abuses, it hands insurgents a propaganda weapon. They can point to these documents and say, "Look, even the United Nations agrees your army is no better than ours." Such narratives are devastating to morale and recruitment. They discourage civilian cooperation with the military and cast doubt on the sacrifices of soldiers who have died defending their communities. The irony is painful. Soldiers in Burkina Faso fight day and night against armed groups that have killed thousands and displaced millions since 2015. They operate with limited resources, stretched across vast rural regions where state presence barely exists. Yet instead of being recognized for this monumental struggle, they are accused, without proof, of committing crimes as horrific as those carried out by insurgents. To many Burkinabe, this feels less like oversight and more like betrayal. The pattern is not new. In Mali, UN peacekeepers produced reports that highlighted allegations of civilian killings while downplaying the advances made against insurgent groups. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, countless UN studies cataloged abuses but did little to halt the cycle of violence. The common thread is that African governments are treated as suspects rather than partners. Their militaries are seen not as protectors, but as potential criminals. It is a framework that serves Western narratives about Africa, one that portrays the continent as eternally unstable, incapable of governing itself without outside supervision. This is why Traoré's government reacted with such fury to the March 2025 report. For them, it was not a neutral document, but a deliberate attempt to undermine their authority at home and abroad. The junta's legitimacy rests on one core promise: to restore security where civilian leaders failed. If the army is painted as no different from insurgents, then that promise is broken, not because of reality on the ground, but because of perception shaped by outsiders. That is why the expulsion of Carol Flores Marexniak was not just an act of anger, it was an act of defense, protecting the very foundation of the government's rule. There is also the question of double standards. Where are the UN's reports on the foreign arms that flood into insurgent hands? Where are the investigations into the funding networks that allow affiliates to buy motorcycles, rifles, and explosives across the Sahel? These questions are rarely prioritized. Instead, the spotlight falls on governments like Burkina Faso, as if the state were the greatest threat to its people. This imbalance is not lost on Burkinabe citizens, who see in it a familiar pattern of Western-driven institutions judging Africans more harshly than anyone else. By rejecting the UN report outright, Traoré sent a clear message. Burkina Faso will no longer play the role of the accused in a courtroom where the judge and jury sit outside Africa. If the UN wants to help, it must fight the real enemy, the insurgents, not weaken the hands of those risking their lives to resist them. Until that shift occurs, Burkina Faso will defend its narrative as fiercely as it defends its villages. But this leads us to a larger truth. The UN's accusations, however biased, did not arise in a vacuum. They are rooted in the complexity of Burkina Faso's war itself, a war where the lines between defender and aggressor have been blurred by necessity, desperation, and survival. Which brings us to the next question. How did Burkina Faso's war reach a stage where such accusations could even be made? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. To understand why the United Nations even dares to accuse the Burkinabe army of abuses, one must grasp the sheer scale and cruelty of the war consuming the country. Burkina Faso is not fighting a conventional battle between two professional armies. It is fighting a war of shadows, where the enemy is not a uniformed soldier across a battlefield, but an invisible network of insurgent groups that melt into villages, forests, and deserts. Since 2015, groups have unleashed a terror campaign that has killed tens of thousands, displaced over 2 million people, and brought entire regions of the country to their knees. Unlike Western armies equipped with satellites, drones, and billion-dollar budgets, the Burkinabe military operates with scarce resources. Soldiers often fight in remote areas without air cover, without medical evacuation, and with outdated weapons. They face enemies who strike suddenly, ambushing convoys, burning markets, raiding schools, and then vanish across porous borders. This is not a war where rules can be neatly applied. It is a war of survival. It is precisely this chaos that blurs the line between defender and perpetrator in the eyes of international observers. In their air-conditioned offices in Geneva and New York, UN officials tally statistics but fail to understand the human reality. When insurgents recruit children, they do not march them into camps wearing uniforms. They infiltrate families, kidnap teenagers, and force entire villages into submission. When militias rise to defend their communities, they do so with minimal training, often in moments of desperation after seeing their relatives slaughtered. Mistakes happen, tragedies happen, but to portray these desperate defenders as moral equals to insurgent killers is not oversight. It is distortion. The creation of civilian defense forces, the volunteers for the defense of the homeland, was born out of necessity, not cruelty. With the army overstretched, villages demanded the right to defend themselves. These volunteers have been the difference between annihilation and survival for countless communities. Yet in UN reports, they are reduced to footnotes of alleged abuses, stripped of context, painted as reckless vigilantes. Such depictions insult the sacrifices of ordinary Burkinabe, who took up arms only because the world abandoned them. The insurgency's brutality also explains why allegations of state abuses arise in the first place. When insurgents massacre dozens in a village, the survivors expect justice. In the fog of war, reprisals sometimes blur into accusations. But these are symptoms of a wider tragedy, a war forced upon Burkina Faso by external insurgent networks. To focus on these symptoms while ignoring the disease itself is to miss the entire point. The UN does not ask how insurgents are armed, how their funding networks operate, or why they continue to expand despite billions poured into counterinsurgency by Western states. Instead, it obsesses over whether the Burkinabe army has stepped out of line. This is why the government views the UN's role not as constructive oversight, but as dangerous interference. By equating the defenders with the aggressors, the UN strengthens insurgent propaganda, weakens national morale, and tarnishes the reputation of a country fighting for its very existence. Burkina Faso's response to expel envoys who spread such distortions is therefore not reckless. It is logical. It is the action of a nation refusing to let outsiders dictate its reality. But one must ask, if the UN keeps repeating the same mistakes, why does Burkina Faso not simply ignore them? Why does it go further, expelling their representatives again and again? The answer lies in the government's larger strategy. Expulsions are not random acts of anger, but deliberate moves in a wider struggle for sovereignty. Which leads us to the next question. Why does Burkina Faso keep expelling UN officials? And what does this reveal about its fight to control its destiny? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. To outside observers, the repeated expulsions of United Nations officials from Burkina Faso may look like arrogance or authoritarian overreach. But for those who understand the deeper reality of the Sahel, these expulsions are not acts of impulsive anger. They are calculated declarations of sovereignty. Each envoy expelled carries a message to the world. Burkina Faso will not let outsiders dictate its narrative, weaken its resolve, or question the sacrifices of its people. Consider the timeline. In December 2022, Barbara Manzi, the UN's top representative at the time, was ordered to leave after she wrote about the devastating toll of the conflict on schools and hospitals. While her blog post may have seemed harmless in New York or Geneva, in Burkina Faso, it sounded like a public relations victory for the insurgents. At the very moment the government was mobilizing volunteers and rallying morale, Here was the UN painting a picture of collapse. The junta saw it for what it was, a blow to public confidence, dressed up as humanitarian concern. She was expelled. Fast forward to 2025, and the same playbook repeats. Karol Flores-Marechniak, barely a year into her appointment, was linked to a report equating Burkinabe soldiers with insurgents. Again, the pattern is unmistakable. UN representatives arrive, publish damning narratives without consultation, and undermine the government's legitimacy. Burkina Faso responds by showing them the door. Far from being chaotic decisions, these expulsions are part of a deliberate strategy, the protection of narrative sovereignty. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, controlling the narrative is as critical as winning battles. His government rose to power, promising to secure the country where others had failed. Every attack on the army's credibility is therefore an attack on the very foundation of its legitimacy. Allowing UN envoys to spread what the junta views as distortions would be political suicide. Expelling them is not only logical, it is essential to survival. There is also a regional context that makes Burkina Faso's expulsions easier to understand. Across the Sahel, governments have grown weary of international institutions that parachute in, write reports, and leave, while the insurgency rages unchecked. In Mali, UN peacekeepers were accused of failing to stop massacres. In Niger, after the 2023 coup, foreign NGOs were sidelined for interfering in domestic matters. Burkina Faso is not an outlier. It is part of a regional shift where African governments are rejecting the model of external supervision. Expelling UN representatives is not isolation. It is alignment with neighbors who are equally determined to reclaim control. Critics argue that this approach carries costs, that it alienates donors and risks cutting off aid. But Burkina Faso's leadership understands the balance. The UN may lose its top envoy, but its humanitarian arms rarely leave. Food aid, refugee assistance, and medical programs usually continue. In other words, Ouagadougou has realized that it can expel individuals without collapsing the entire aid pipeline. The expulsions thus achieve maximum political impact with minimal humanitarian cost. Most importantly, these expulsions resonate domestically. To ordinary Burkinabe, the act of rejecting a UN envoy is a symbol of pride. It tells citizens that their government will not be treated as a colony, that their soldiers will not be smeared without evidence, and that their sovereignty will not be compromised for international approval. In villages where people have lost relatives to insurgent attacks, this kind of defiance matters. It shows them that their leaders are standing firm not only against insurgents, but against the global institutions that too often ignore African dignity. The UN, of course, portrays itself as regretful, deeply concerned, or open to dialogue whenever these expulsions occur. But the reality is that it has failed to adjust its approach. Instead of working in genuine partnership with African governments, it continues to act as judge and jury, delivering verdicts without consultation. Burkina Faso has simply had enough. This is why the pattern of expulsions is unlikely to stop. As long as international officials arrive with ready-made conclusions that discredit the nation, the government will continue to push them out. For Traoré and his supporters, this is not isolation, it is liberation. Burkina Faso is writing its own story, on its terms. But that leads us to the final question. If Burkina Faso continues down this path, expelling envoys and rejecting oversight, what future awaits the country? Is it building a new model of African sovereignty, or risking a slide into dangerous isolation? Burkina Faso today stands at a crossroads that will define not only its future, but perhaps the future of African sovereignty itself. With the expulsion of 2 UN envoys in less than 3 years, the country has drawn a line in the sand. It will no longer accept international institutions that arrive with lectures, condemnations, and reports designed to weaken its defenders. Captain Ibrahim Traoré has made it clear that his government does not measure legitimacy by the approval of New York or Geneva, but by the trust of the Burkinabe people who live and die under the shadow of insurgent violence. To the outside world, this posture looks dangerous. Diplomats in Western capitals warn that such defiance risks isolation, cuts off aid, and damages Burkina Faso's image abroad. Yet this is precisely the point. Traoré is not trying to polish Burkina Faso's image for outsiders. he is trying to protect the dignity of a nation that has too long been humiliated by foreign dictates. For decades, African states were treated as wards of the international system, constantly supervised, constantly judged, and constantly portrayed as incapable of managing their affairs. Burkina Faso is now rejecting that model outright. Instead of isolation, the junta has pursued new alliances that reflect this independent posture. French troops were sent home, Russian advisors and weapons were welcomed in. Cooperation with neighbors like Mali and Niger has deepened, creating a Sahelian bloc that speaks with one voice. Africa will no longer accept Western tutelage. This reorientation is not about closing doors. It is about opening new ones with partners who respect sovereignty rather than undermine it. The expulsions of UN officials, then, are not signs of Burkina Faso turning inward, but of Burkina Faso choosing its company. Of course, challenges remain immense. The insurgency continues to expand, villages are abandoned, and millions remain displaced. Critics insist that the only way forward is deeper engagement with institutions like the UN, the EU, or France. But Burkina Faso's leaders argue the opposite. Those same institutions had decades to fix the crisis, and instead of solutions, they delivered lectures, dependency, and failure. Why repeat the same formula? By asserting sovereignty, even if it comes at the cost of friction with the UN, the government believes it is laying the foundation for real independence. Domestically, this message resonates. When Traoré speaks of rejecting foreign meddling, he taps into deep frustration among Burkinabe youth who have grown weary of seeing their country portrayed as a victim or a perpetual failure. Expelling envoys is not seen as recklessness. It is seen as courage. It is proof that Burkina Faso has leaders willing to defend the nation's dignity as fiercely as they defend its borders. In a region where trust in international institutions has collapsed, such actions build legitimacy at home even as they draw criticism abroad. The risk, of course, is whether symbolism can translate into results. Sovereignty alone will not feed the displaced or defeat the insurgents. Traoré's government knows this, which is why it has invested in alternative partnerships and homegrown strategies, mobilizing civilian volunteers, strengthening regional cooperation, and pursuing industrial projects that lessen dependence on foreign aid. The path is hard, but it is one chosen freely, not imposed. That distinction matters. And so, the future of Burkina Faso is not a question of isolation versus cooperation. It is a question of who sets the terms. If the UN refuses to adapt, if it continues to publish reports that equate armies with insurgents, then it will continue to be pushed aside. But if new alliances provide the tools Burkina Faso needs to survive and rebuild, then the country may emerge stronger, not weaker, from its defiance. The expulsion of Carol Flores Marexniak is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of a new chapter in which African nations like Burkina Faso are saying loudly and clearly, "We will decide our destiny. We will defend our fighters, and we will no longer be judged by outsiders who do not share our struggle." Whether the world calls that isolation or sovereignty makes no difference. For Burkina Faso, it is simply freedom. Is Burkina Faso right to defy the UN? Has Africa had enough outside control? Let us know in the comment section. What do you see? Sovereignty or isolation? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.